All right, I see everybody else is here. Valerie Pena, Midnight, John West, Sarah on the call remotely. So we have all of our members present.
Do I can then do a roll call? Midnight,
Here.
Valerie Pena, here. John West,
Here.
Roy Sim,
Here.
Sarah Valley Davidson.
Here.
Yeah, she's still working on her video. Okay. We have minutes from our April 19th meeting in your packet. We'll have had a chance to review those, and if so, entertain a motion to approve when one.
Second.
Motion to second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right.
I said aye, but I didn't
Thank
get a
you,
chance
Sarah.
to say aye. Yes, thanks.
Thank you. Unanimously approved. In our governance section, we still are tweaking a couple things in the support agreement, and wanted to make sure before we officially adopt it and prove it that if there are any more questions from the board members, we get those answered. So I'll open it up for any of our board members to ask questions about our existing modified support agreement.
Can you review real quickly the changes you made since last meeting?
I suppose the main change was to substitute in a dispute resolution provision in section 7 for what earlier was there that talked about people in litigation or a party in litigation being able to obtain attorney fees as a result of successful litigation. This much more, I think, appropriately reflects the nature of the relationship and how we would go about resolving disputes. So that's the main change.
That's it?
Yeah. For 60 insurance, because the way I read it is that it's only John who will have insurance, liability insurance. Says. Oh, where are you seeing that? Well, it says the city shall maintain
That's my bond.
CBC on behalf, somebody's treasurer. And in the other appropriate persons who have the authority to sign checks on behalf of the CBC. And then any other bonds as may be necessary or appropriate. Right. So, and that last part is reflecting that we will be getting directors and officers insurance for the entirety of the board. Okay. Yeah. So it's not spelled out, it's just by that. It's in the cap. Thanks.
You see it?
In fact, it's referenced a little bit earlier in the where it says the city shall also maintain CI's behalf. General liability insurance, car insurance, and directors and officers. Yeah, so that's what's covered.
Question, any others?
You only insured me for $15,000.
It's all right, our budget's zero right now.
I'm gonna do something, it's gonna be a little more than that.
That'll be your still.
You don't have to pay that part of the minutes, by the way.
Any other questions on the support agreement? Comfortable, then I think a motion to accept it so that we can get it signed by the appropriate parties would be the next step.
I would move to accept the changes that were made to the agreement and move forward, having it approved.
Second. Second. Okay. Motion and second. Any discussion, further discussion on that? Hearing none, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
Roll call.
Aye.
Okay, since Sarah's online, we have to roll call. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Hi, Sarah. We see you. Okay, we're going to do a roll call vote due to the fact that we have a member online. So,
Nick Lanson.
yes.
Valerie Pena.
Yes.
John West.
Yes.
Roy Sim.
Yes.
Sarah Valley Davidson.
Yes.
Right, next item is also the next item on your packet. It's the conflict of interest policy. This is something that Beth, would you mind kind of walking us through the basic tenets of it? And then we have a real example to walk through here in a second, but first the broader perspective of what it states for members.
Sure. So a standard policy for a board such as this would be a conflicts of interest policy that allows the board to evaluate potential conflicts that may come up with respect to members of the board that may have relationships with anything that might have business that's going on with the entity. And this is a pretty kind of bare bones, straightforward example of such a policy that actually our outside nonprofit corporation council shared with us and suggested for this body, and that we basically adapted for its use. And it's pretty straightforward. It states purpose of the policy is to protect the interests of the organization when it's looking at entering into a transaction or arrangement that might in fact benefit a private interest of an officer or a director of the organization, or also result in an excess benefit. That's dependent upon. And basically it's a policy of the organization. There are applicable state and federal laws that apply in any given case with respect to a particular transaction. But this really sets out what should suffice to deal with conflicts issues from an Indiana state law standpoint. And it basically says if you're a director, principal officer, a member of a committee that has delegated powers, and you have a financial interest directly or indirectly, and that's defined in here, then you're an interested person. And then what you would do is disclose that interest to the rest of the board, explain the relationship that you see, your potential relationship between that interest and what transaction or transactions are before the board, and then leave, and the rest of the board will decide whether it is a conflict. Not all interests are necessarily conflicts of interest, but is there a conflict? Really meaning, is there something that would compromise the impartiality, the judgment of the director in making a decision? And then what steps, if any, should be taken to address the conflict. So that's in a nutshell what the policy says. And then the definition of financial interest hones in on what sorts of things are of interest to this policy. And if a person or their family has a direct or indirect business or investment or family interest, an ownership interest or an investment interest with an entity that they're looking to do business with, some kind of compensation arrangement with someone that the organization is transacting with, or a proposed interest of that sort, then those are the sorts of things that we look at for someone, for a board member or officer to disclose. These are the sorts of things that you will come across. This should be very familiar with those policies that you will have encountered to any other organizational setting you've ever been in. So anyway, that's in a nutshell what it says and does. I'm happy to try to answer questions.
Sure. Board members have questions? Okay. So there's a procedure in Article 3 that speaks to how we would entertain one of these. I think first we'll adopt the policy as a practice for our board. If that's acceptable to everyone, we'll vote on that in a moment. And then we have a real world one to discuss. So as I understand the procedure, that is done in this forum.
Yes.
With the person choosing to present or not. The person, and in this case, has disclosed to me that they think they have an interest that should be explored. And then that person gives a room and we, the rest of the board members, take a vote. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So first thing first is to.
I have a question.
Yes, we have two. I see your hand.
Sorry.
Doris has hers up and then I'll get to you.
Oh, sorry. I didn't hear everything.
Usually some conflict of interest policies, then every the directors would sign a conflict of interest policy. So we're just going to have a policy, but not everyone's going to sign it to say they've received it and agreed to.
Yeah, so the typical thing service on, say, city boards and commissions, it has been that people do annual disclosures and just kind of state generally what their outside financial interests are that might have some relevance to what they're doing in connection with a particular board or commission. And so I think that's probably what you're thinking about.
I said on the sign conflict of interest.
Right, that kind of annual disclosure. So what this is contemplating is you've got a policy that sort of sits as an umbrella over the organization, and then as things arise, they will be disclosed by board members or directors or officers, as opposed to signing some generalized annual disclosure. And I should say that I actually would like to see us revise the way we do members conflicts, because I think it actually gets to the spirit of conflicts management much more if that is a meeting by meeting thing, or as you're dealing with the material being presented in a given meeting, whatever transactions you're looking at, et cetera. On any board and commission, there would be sort of right up front a moment to say, does anyone have any conflicts that they're going to have to recuse? So that it's really a more thoughtful in a way analysis meeting by meeting than signing something. I mean, the way I see it work in practice is people sign things and then they may be attentive to that throughout the year, but it also feels like a pro forma exercise. And by the way, we chase people down throughout the year trying to get them to actually do their disclosures. And sometimes we never get them. So that feels a little bit more like a formalistic exercise. I actually think this is with an appropriate time at the beginning of each CBCI meeting to touch base on, are there any conflicts that we need to address in the meeting? I think that's better for the spirit of what conflicts of interest policies are about. Does that make sense? Does that help answer your question?
Well, I understand what you're saying, but that means every 2 weeks we're putting on the table. Does anybody have any conflicts with what we're giving each other?
It's just, yeah, it's just, and that could be 2 seconds because it's just a reminder. And you're looking at that every time you're engaging in any business for CBCI, just like any board that you're on or commission. You know, every time you get something, like when I used to sit on the plan commission, and every time I got a packet, I'm thinking, do I have any relationship to any of this stuff? Is there any conflict? So it's just that what we haven't been doing, I think, so much in boards and commissions here generally is kind of having that kind of base touching moment at the beginning of meetings to just make sure people have thought about it and kind of report. So that's.
Yes, Sarah, you had your hand up.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
There.
Yeah, just so you know, for some reason now I can't unmute myself, so I'm not sure why, but anyway, thanks.
You're muted now.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, and my apologies, Doris. I thought it was a little bit hard for me to hear, so I didn't realize that. I thought that we were moving on beyond Q&A. So I have 2 questions. One is, Beth, can you explain to us a little bit more about how family is defined in this particular document? Because I don't see a definition, so I'm not sure
It's not typically how it's defined is, and we can add a definition here, certainly amend that to make that clearer, but typically how it's defined in conflicts policies is spouse and anyone else who is a financial dependent. So it can have a family member who's a financial dependent, like children who are still in the home. The idea being that if they've got a financial interest, it's likely to be your financial interest as well.
Okay, so it doesn't include adult children. It doesn't include siblings, or it doesn't include parents of the person.
Typically not if they're financially independent.
Okay, and then my second question is, I don't know if this would be kind of supported in other documents other than this one, but what would the procedure be if someone failed to disclose, because the document places the burden of, it just explains the procedure in expectation that people comply. I'm just kind of curious what would happen. You know, what would the procedure be if someone didn't or forgot or something? I don't know. I don't know why, but I'm just kind of curious.
We should talk about that. I think that the, you know, it kind of depends on the nature of the situation, I would expect. So there may be things in which it seems significant enough that you might want to revisit a decision in which someone with a conflict was involved. And there may be cases where it doesn't have a material negative impact, or you think it's not going to harm the essence of the decision making. So I think it's case by case, and I would leave that to the board to decide.
Okay, as just one other follow-up question, since, and my apologies, I can hear most of what's happening in the room, but this is not the ideal setup to be participating remotely, and I apologize for needing to do that today. But it sounds like this is a kind of a pretty standard disclosure document that, or conflict of interest disclosure document that you use in other contexts. And so I guess my final question would be, have there been examples of issues where this hasn't been followed or someone failed to disclose on other boards and commissions, and how that was, how that process was handled in those instances?
I am not aware myself of a failure to disclose interest, which might constitute a conflict of interest. That what involved someone's decision making or participation decision on a board or commission that may have happened in the past. I'm not familiar with it, so I can't really speak to that. I will say, as I said before, we've actually spent a fair amount of time in the legal department just trying to chase down people to get the annual disclosures signed. That doesn't mean if they haven't signed one that they have some outside financial interest that poses a problem. It's just literally, if you will, not following the process. And that has just been a headache, and to my knowledge hasn't really resulted in anyone getting off the board or anything like that. That's of that sort of impact. So yeah, I don't have had experience of their own tenure.
Got a follow-up, Sarah? Oh, okay.
Just thank you to Beth for answering those questions.
Sure. And we can amend, revise, add to, et cetera, the policy as the board may want in terms of process.
So we at least have a suggested amendment to define family.
Mm-hmm.
So we understand what that means. Which I suppose we could act on the document if we were comfortable with saying we would just anticipate the amendment to reflect the definition that Beth just discussed, or if you're not comfortable with that, we can push it back 2 weeks and adopt it then. So I'll leave it to the board members as to how you'd like to proceed with the acceptance of a potential amendment to and adoption of then the conflict of interest policy for our board.
I think we ought to accept it subject to the change and let that do the change and move on.
Okay, so that's sort of the form of a recommendation or motion. Is anybody second motion, I guess? Okay.
I'll second that.
Okay. A discussion about that motion?
Yes, I would like to see how we look in the family. I think that just if we have adult children, we have a fun and all own the business together, that is a financial interest. And if I have a sibling, yeah. So I really would like to see how they're going to define that. So
yes, that's totally fine. I'm looking at the. We're just pulling up the definition under the state law that applies to state employees, for example. Interest and it talks about dependents. It's usually the employer, their dependents. That would be the spouse of a public servant, a child, stepchild, or adoptee who is unemancipated and less than 18 years of age. An individual more than one half of whose support was provided during the year by the public servant. So that's where you get that kind of sense of it's someone who has or is assumed to have, in the case of an unemancipated child in the home, financial support by the individual. So, but I can share some definitions.
Yeah, so me understand, then how is it defined currently under the city's conflict of interest, or is it defined?
I think it's defined similarly for where interest disclosures that they have to make. Those are filed with the state of Indiana, as opposed to board and commission members and volunteers. If you have a city employee who actually has a potential conflict of interest, they file a form, and that is actually sent up. It's signed, so reviewed, approved, handled if there's a potential conflict, and then that form is actually signed and sent up to the state house. So that's the employee side of things, but it provides some definitions and some reference points. Does that help?
No.
No?
Okay. How it's defined? I guess my question is, what does it have on it? It doesn't define children. Does it specifically have that language?
It would be an adult child if more than half of their support is provided during the year by the public servant, by the individual employee. So it doesn't have to only be children below the age of 18, but it's dependency that is eligible. So, I mean, I know I hear what you're saying. You're saying, look, I care about the welfare of my family members, so I wouldn't have this potentially affect my partiality or impartiality.
Well, no, I'm saying because it's a conflict policy, I have to disclose if I'm in business with my adult son and we own a business together, and then we go something that the CBCI is interested in.
Sure.
What this is saying is I don't have to disclose that.
No, that's not true, because if you have an interest, disclose. Sure, if you own a business or have some kind of business investment in your son's business, and that's going, your son is going for some interaction with CBCI, and you have to disclose. Yeah.
But if your son had a business, you didn't have any financial
Then
interest in that, you wouldn't have to disclose it. You may choose to recuse yourself just out of,
Exactly.
you know,
I mean,
because, but you don't have to, you wouldn't have to bring it in front of the group and have that all.
right. Or just disclose it in relation to meeting without recusing. That way everyone knows about it and can judge from there.
That help?
Yeah.
Answer your question?
Yes.
If there's any other questions about the proposed amendment to have Beth write the family definition, and I think we've discussed what we now think some of the nuance of family is, and she'll use the state version of the family definition for the amended document. So the motion on the floor is to amend the document, adopt the document with the amendment at this meeting, knowing that the amendment is not in writing yet until after this meeting. That makes sense to everyone. I want you to vote on something you don't understand. Okay, so the motion and the seconds on the floor. This is we call roll call as well because Sarah's online. Okay. Guys, would you mind calling the roll on this proposal?
Mr. Nixon,
Yes.
Kelly Payne,
Yes.
John Mark,
Yes.
Joyson,
Yes.
Sarah Valley Jameson,
Yes.
Have an adopted conflict of interest policy with an amendment forthcoming in writing, but we know that that will be reflective of our discussion here in a minute. We have a real world example to now entertain. Mr. West is on our committee that's reviewing RFI responses. We have not made any decisions yet. That group is not ready to make any recommendations. However, John called me and said he may have a potential interest and he wanted to disclose that. And now we have an official policy for that to take place in the procedure. So John, would you like to explain your interest in how that might be impacting this?
Sure. This is probably going to continue for as long as I'm on this board because I'm a commercial broker by it's my trade, and having done it for north of 30 years, I'm going to have done some business or had some kind of contractual relationship with a whole lot of people that will end up going out and talking to. So as an example, we've got 3 bids on phase 1 parcels. And over the course of years, I've had a business relationship with virtually everyone in some way. I'm not currently under contract with any of them, but most likely once the business with at least one of them again. May not even be the one we awarded to, so it'll be a moot point, but this is going to come up all the time. I mean, almost virtually every 2 weeks, I'm going to raise my hand going through this conversation. So it's the downside of finding somebody that knows real estate in this community. Because if you know it, then you've been doing business with all these folks, and it is what it is. But it's out there. And, and another example of what could happen, again, that would be way down the road, but just to give you a real life example of what could happen. Let's say there's a lot of residential product that's built, and one of the developers hires my company to sell houses. It's possible. That could happen. Not by tomorrow, but it's possible.
So just to clarify, you have relationships with all of the people potentially we were looking at.
I've had business relationships with all. I don't currently have a contract, and I'm not doing business.
Okay.
Contractually, I'm not doing business with any of them today. But I have done it at some level. It's not all the same type of business that I've done, but I've done business with virtually everybody that's submitted at some level.
Does the board have other questions to understand in any more detail the relationships, or? I think the next thing would be just in terms of the process, for you to step out, and then the rest of the board can discuss it.
And out here in help people get into the mayor's office. I got it. Step down.
Yeah. You have to kind of kick that piece sticking out.
But do you have a general piece of guidance on the disclosure that Mr. West gave us and how that might impact anything?
It sounds like, if I'm understanding it correctly, he's done business with the folks who have responded to the RFI, done business with them in the past, meaning that as housing gets developed at some point, he may be sought to help sell that and then make money in the marketplace at that point. And that's happened in the past. If those relationships are more or less equivalent across those 3, I don't know that there would be any reason, especially with everything so attenuated now and so much still undecided. I don't know that I would necessarily see that as a conflict. I think the policy contemplates something perhaps a little bit more concrete. In other words, at least an existing relationship on one end. One piece is nailed down. This feels like both are nailed down. And he's made the disclosure, but it's really up to you. I mean, you need to feel comfortable with the impartiality of everyone who's evaluating those responses. So that's ultimately the bottom line.
That's why I asked the question I did, because I wanted to establish that he has worked with all of them, at some point. There's not one in particular that, he has done. They all three are equal in that sense, in that he currently does not have any work or contract signed with anyone. I think in a town our size, it's going to be pretty hard to avoid when anyone's in a particular industry that's going to be connected to this project in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm. So, can I just interrupt very quickly? Just sorry.
Sure, go ahead, Sarah.
Just because I'm just curious, given the setup and the fact that we're like recording this, but he's supposed to be like not part of the discussion. Should we be recording this part of the discussion?
Well,
It's still public.
It's a good question. I mean, we sort of, try to do things as publicly and transparently as possible. Here, I think the idea behind usually having someone step out is just so the board can feel that it's able to discuss this freely. So if you think that that can happen, I would continue to go ahead and record it. There is a concern about that. I have a little bit of it. I think you sort of discuss it openly because I don't know how it's transparent otherwise.
I would personally rather have someone from the general public ask me about it. I could say we had an open discussion about it, and in fact, you can see the recording.
Yeah, no, I was just kind of curious because I don't know kind of how when we have these kind of things where people about the room, it's totally fine. I was just kind of curious. So
sure.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, in honesty, even the policy that you're operating under, I mean, most nonprofits are not doing everything like this publicly. So we're modifying the CBCI's operations because we want to make sure that they are as transparent as possible. So that's why all of this is happening in a much more open and public. I think it ordinarily would in a nonprofit context.
Other book members have feedback about Mr. West's disclosure.
As I feel like he doesn't currently have a relationship, I think it would be more of a discussion that he disclosed was I have a relationship with one of the developers who are currently bidding on who completed the so we're currently looking at, then we know right off he's gonna have a financial interest if they get that contract. But since he doesn't, and since our policy seems like that we're going to be every meeting, we're going to open it up to say, here's what's on the agenda. Do you have a conflict with any of that? When we go through this process, that will be revealed as it goes on.
Mm-hmm. And once again, we just ask him to recuse himself if we were in that situation.
It is, as he says, I mean, it's sort of what always tends to raise potential conflicts is on the one hand, you're trying to get someone who's very familiar with the landscape of the work you're doing. On the other hand, that means it almost inevitably, especially in a small place like Bloomington, you're going to have some history of relationships with people. And he's been very open about this. So it's his credit.
And I would like to say that John has to sell financially just because he's saying honest.
Is there any feedback from you?
Yes, I agree with the kind of what's been said in the room. It seems I certainly appreciate that it seems like John is operating under an abundance of caution to bring this to our attention. It doesn't seem to require disclosure, given the policy that we just voted to put in place. But I do appreciate that he is really thinking about trying to over disclose rather than under disclose. That being said, I think given what many people in the room have already articulated, it seems like it's fine to kind of have him go forward at this time without sort of any kind of mitigation requirements on him. I don't think that this rises to the level of needing to require him to recuse himself or anything like that.
I think everyone's had their say, and if not, now's the time to to conclude that discussion. Any other feedback on this?
You have anybody?
I concur with the comments from the board. I think that Mr. West, in all the best reasons, disclosed this in the right way and in advance in concern for not wanting to have a potential conflict. I don't think there is one in this case. He has no current contract with any of them. And I think if he were to enter into one, he would tell us right away, and then we could take action at that phase. But he has no current business interest with any of them, and to me that means he meets the policy, the intent of our policy. So I'm very comfortable with saying let him continue on in his role at the moment. It's just, this is for the public here, is simply to be on our review committee that will make a recommendation on potentially one of the respondents to the phase one bids that we received, which then still has to go not just to this board, but to the development commission. So we're far from at a point where the final decision is made and we don't even get to make it. So I think we're well within our comfort level of allowing Mr. West to continue on and help advise us in this case.
So I think under the policy, then the final procedure is for you to vote on whether a conflict exists, and I would do that as a roll call vote as well.
That's my next question. So let's do a roll call vote.
Commissioner Nelson?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. I need to understand. No, there is no conflict.
Yeah.
So I vote no. He has a no conflict. Sorry. Thank you for clarifying.
Yes.
No,
No.
I think I voted no, but you're right.
No conflict.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bring Mr. West back in. Nothing like a new board. And immediately we have a discussion item. I think I've been on all these other boards, and in history, Doris, like you, I've signed things at the beginning and no one's ever disclosed a single thing during the whole tenure of the board.
Said you signed it, and then you get you signed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's what I'd like to see a change.
Which I think, you know, when you explain every meeting that good policy.
So guys, we'll need to add that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. John, we unanimously agree that you have no conflict for this project. So we're
Yes, we have no comment.
Yeah.
you have zero.
I asked America to pack up and leave. He told me no.
And all of us appreciate that you were thoughtful and brought that forward, even though we didn't see any potential conflict. We appreciate that you were willing to put that out for us. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay, we will now move on to the Hopewell section of our agenda. Both, Beth, if you need to go, that's absolutely fine. And Scott will get you in here right away after Beth takes off. Both Deb and I have a real quick RDC meeting update to deliver, and then Scott, you can present to us. Climb across the table. So on Monday, May 1st, I went on behalf of this board to the Redevelopment Commission to show them our reporting lines document, that those two graphics that we've been tweaking to sort of introduce them to them, how we believe we interface with them and the administration. I thought that went well. Deb was there. They asked really good questions, but they clearly understand how we can help, how our role will allow for them not to have to manage projects moving forward at Hopewell, that they still continue to do what they've always done, hold land, disperse of land, approve funds for redevelopment of land, but they did not want to have anything to do with managing the project like our entity will be doing at some point in the future. So they're very appreciative and thought that there was value in that. And that was the introduction to them. And then later, Deb made a report on other activities. I'll let you share that and what happened at that section of the RDC meeting.
So we did just an overall update. We did that in February, and we're going to try to do that once a quarter just to make sure everybody's up to speed, and because there's a lot happening all the time. In that, we had also been working on a budget reconciliation, and if some of you are very familiar with the fact that when a project is created, it has it's called a project review form, and the project review form really sets forth not only the budget from these are the uses that we're going to have, but it also sets forth what are the sources that those things are from. And so we did an update to them, identified, had some early counsel with Cindy already on that. And they really wanted to see, you know, what's coming for the next couple of years, right? Don't just bring us like one thing. And we did have a little cleanup to do on our project review form that we found. So we did that cleanup and they wanted to see what that future was going to look like. I think it would be good for them at the next meeting to bring that back to this group in more detail. I know we had other things on the agenda today, but in 2 weeks, Nick, I might suggest we bring more detail back. But what we did is we projected out what we think the next couple of years are, including the development owners rep, right? Including increased security, which is another question that I'll bring it to you. The Jackson Street is going, you know, so there's like a number of things that continue to be identified. In that, with the fix that we had, as well as the increases, the redevelopment commission did agree to shift from a $25 million TIF commitment to a $30 million TIF commitment for Hopewell. And we can show you as great a detail as you would like to talk about in that. The one thing we did clarify with them is that that does not include if any future infrastructure needs to be accomplished by the city, any other new roads, you know, of course, we're trying to get the developer to do it. That's going to be difficult. We acknowledge, very difficult, but that's a whole different ballgame. But as far as everything else that we need to do, we think that's going to get us through the next years. So again, kind of, that's a high level of what we did. We had sounding support from the RNC to move that forward, but they did ask an interesting question, and that was, why are we paying for security? Why don't we just demolish some of those buildings? They're going to be gone anyway. Isn't it cheaper for us to demolish the building versus pay for additional security over the next couple of years? So that is something, and I think it's a super valid question, and one that we definitely need to explore. So that is one of the follow-up items that we're going to have. And frankly, the developers want the buildings down as well. Now, the question will be, for those of you who are really into the details here, 714 South Rogers, there is at least one proposal who is proposing to reduce that. So, you know, do we take that one down or just the others? But, you know, rather than continue to pay for security, let's just, or at least heavier security, let's take down the places that are causing the security, which is some of that demolition. So that's going to be a question that's coming forth, I would say, relatively quickly. And we're going to try to bring something back to the redevelopment commission on May 15th. In addition to that, the owner's development rep, as you all know, several of you have been on the committee. We have 5, we interviewed 5, we shortlisted to 2. We have been, we interviewed them twice, we got more information. I've talked to them many, many times, almost daily. But I think we are finally at a point where we are getting very close to having a good fee negotiated with them and a schedule of how they're going to do their work. So if all goes well, we are planning to, on the May 15th redevelopment commission, is have a presentation by the proposed vendor. And then that would then potentially probably lead into a contract, if everything goes well there, would lead into a contract on June 5th. So it may be good. I don't know if the CBCI wants to just listen in on that conference, the RDC meeting that night, but that'd be one way to do that. But I think for those of you who haven't heard from them, met from them, particularly Sarah and Doris, that would be another time to listen and hear what they're going to say. So it'll be a 2-step process.
And because we're still in discussions with our final 2 respondents, we're not disclosing their names publicly because we are still negotiating, and that hopefully will be something that is ready for public feedback on the 15th. So maybe put on your calendars watching that RDC meeting to get a glimpse of what the recommended vendor might be proposing that night.
And that's 5 o'clock.
5 o'clock on Monday, the 15th, right?
You have both making a presentation or the one where you landed on
The preferred.
Is it available in Zoom?
It is.
In person?
It is. Yes.
I want to go there.
The answer is yes.
You don't have
She
to.
has a contact.
I like options. I just say that.
All right, that concludes what you need to say at the moment.
I think so.
All right, then we're going to go to Scott. Scott, we are what we're hearing from you on sustainability and affordability from the planning lens as it relates to the Hopewell project.
Thanks, Nick. Scott Robinson, Director of Planning and Transportation. How's that? Gonna do?
Like
I have some slides I was going to show.
Okay, great. This is our educational series.
This is educational, and I don't want to get too wonky into planning talk. So I'll try to keep it short. There's probably more slides that I need to show. Sarah, can you see that? Hopefully. Okay. So this is a aerial view of the former hospital site of Hopewell neighborhood. Outlined in black is the overlay boundary. So TRO stands for Transform Redevelopment Overlay. So we're transforming the area. The idea behind this overlay is it could be used in other areas in the community. So Plan Commission City Council could adopt the TRO and apply it elsewhere in the community. The first start here is in the Hopewell neighborhood. Zoning, we have our zoning districts and they all have their base standards. And what the TRO or the overlay does is essentially creates a uniform zoning standard for the areas that the overlay applies. So even though we have underlying zoning, which is highlighted here with the MN, which is mixed use medium scale, MI mixed use institutional, and RN residential multifamily that are within the overlay. The TRO overlay went through the standards and tried to unify them so that they're consistent with a more urban context than maybe some of those underlying zoning districts. I also highlighted the R4 residential core, or that's our kind of small lot residential district. That's within the Hopewell neighborhood. It's not included within the overlay for two reasons. One, the R4 is the smallest, most flexible residential district. And that portion of Hopewell is where we mostly envision row houses and smaller residential types where you're not going to see the mixed use uses, the multi-story buildings that we would see in the rest of the site. So that's why that portion is excluded from the overlay.
So R4 includes blocks 8, 9, and 10, or just 2?
9 and
9 and 10. Okay, that must mean that the 714 is the one that's not in R4.
That's the RM district.
Thank you. Right next to it. So the 714 building, Brutalist building, is out of it. It's in RM.
Correct.
The other 2 blocks are in R4.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Nick passes the test on the spatial. Great question. Mixed use institutional.
Yeah.
That's the property that's owned by MCCSC. Each zoning district has permitted uses and conditional uses. So with that MI district, we had to recognize, because it's under the ownership of MCCSC, historic nature, that because of the overlay, we reverted. The overlay kind of removes that and creates a uniform district for everybody. What we could have done is we could have just gone through and rezoned this whole area if it's a different zoning district, but the overlay essentially does that. Does that make sense for us?
Yeah, the TRO. Oh,
so the TRO is now over this, and I'm just showing what the underlying zoning. So if in the future something were to happen in that area, the TRO would apply as opposed to the next.
So you could move something down and make it something else.
Yes.
Scott, could you just real briefly just give us a description of what MM allows, what's permitted?
Yeah, so mixed use medium scale. And boy, you're gonna really challenge me on remembering, but generally you're looking at a 3 to 4 story building. First floor would allow for either residential or non-residential uses that we anticipate mixed. And then in the zoning code, there's a whole range of different uses, you know, kind of broken out generally by housing or residential uses, institutional government uses, retail, non-retail, service, what have you. So you'll get kind of a mix between those uses in the MM district as opposed to the MH mixed use. I'm getting all the districts mixed up. There's a more intense district that will allow more of those uses than would be in the MM. And then one of the slides we'll show how we kind of combine the uses that we would allow here that might not have been allowed under the existing zoning. So again, it's kind of that median context and maybe the higher districts that we have zoned. In my mind, I apologize, just going to blank on those other districts, the mixed use corridor and the MH and the student mixed use student housing. Those are the more.
Well, it's well charted in the code too.
Yeah.
So I mean,
It's not just a framework of this. I mean, the master plan was complete and then the city did some rezoning to make the master plan function, right? And I don't know if that's important to the conversation, but some of this here used to be.
Yeah, so when we went through the rezoning process, we used the master plan as a guide to help make sure we rezone it. So the base zoning is based on what was in the master plan and what the anticipated intensity and uses were there. But what happened is we saw a need for more flexibility and to create maybe a more uniform rule book, so to speak, when we're working out with developers, so they're not being like, for example, the brutalist building. Under current code, RM would allow for some small non-residential uses like a coffee shop. Everybody loves the coffee shop. You know, that wouldn't be permitted there, but the TRO would allow that. So that's where, again, trying to create more of a uniform playbook for each area when working with potential developers, they understand as a whole, as opposed to each partial individually. Next slide. I'm going to go through these quickly because it's just planning to happen. I don't want to get into that, but I do want to highlight again some of the things we're doing to help create that more kind of urban context for the Hopewell neighborhood. And how do we do that? So one of the things we're requiring are alleys, like you'd see in the downtown or more urban areas. Why do we want to require alleys? We want to minimize curb cuts, driveway cuts, and what have you. So that way developments would access their sites via the alley in the rear. That creates a more presence forward or eyes on the street, active streetscape. That's the sort of things that we're trying to achieve there. It also helps break up building mass. My favorite example is across the street. Smallwood, you know, a whole city block, a very large building. People feel like if you can break the scale of the buildings down, it's not so much the height, but it helps break that massing down, that large wall of multiple stories. And alleys again helps achieve some of those aesthetics that people desire. So next time as a so again, we require alleys, require access off the alleys again to minimize the curb cuts. This slide. We're going to kind of go quickly. Pervious surface. So the code require areas that can have maximums of pervious surface where water can't infiltrate versus landscape areas. So what the TRO did is we increased the impervious surface. So you're allowed to have more impervious surface than you would in the underlying zoning. And we reduced the landscape area. So we're creating a larger building footprint that you could allow in each building lot than you could the prior zoning. So that again is to help create that more urban environment. We also reduced the side and rear yard setbacks. So again, that's where your how far your building has to be placed on the lot and how close things can be. We have 0 lot lines. Again, that helps create that more urban context that you might see in a downtown area than you would with the existing zoning. Minimum lot size, you can have smaller lots here than you would again with the base zoning. Next slide. Next slide, guys. Minimum parking. One of the things that partly because of the parking garage, one of the things that we hope to do is encourage people to use existing parking garage on the site and not require minimum parking. There's some things that maybe if it's a small use, the code would require to provide a minimum amount of on-site parking. This could be seen as an incentive. I saw by, hey, I don't have to provide parking. If you want to, you can, but we're not requiring parking. Next slide. And then this slide here just highlights some other things that were done to kind of achieve that kind of pedestrian scale, access to the neighborhood. One of the things that we have a lot of debate about, first floor residential. How do we achieve first floor residential so people aren't looking into bedrooms and kitchens? So here in the TRO, you're allowed to have first floor residential, but we want it to be raised a little bit above the sidewalk, 2 to 5 feet above grade. So it gives some of that privacy, but still you're getting that eyes in the street. And then there's some other stuff here about courtyards and whatever, again, to make sure the facades of the buildings aren't just a giant big blank wall. You're breaking up some of that facade and creating some interest. That's what I'll just highlight. The building floor plate, I don't know if anybody's familiar with that term, but if you think of the first floor, what's the maximum square footage that you're allowed? The way our code is structured has limitations on how big of that building footprint you can have. And that gets into how we trigger our incentives for affordability and sustainability. So this is very similar that we have elsewhere in the downtown, is this maximum floor plate, but it ties into the incentives that we have later, which I'll talk about. This goes a little bit into how we kind of adjusted the uses in the overlay. So without getting into the differences between which underlying zoning will change, this is just a real quick highlight on which uses were excluded. Hopefully there aren't anything here that raises any concerns, but these are generally things that we would not allow or be permitted within the TRO that might have been permitted under the underlying zoning. Likewise, we changed some uses that are permitted. So for example, I already talked a little bit about the restaurant, the RM district, where we think that's a completely appropriate use in Hopewell, but it might not be an appropriate use elsewhere in the community under that RM zoning designation. So that's how we, again, kind of fine-tune some of the zoning districts. Slide. Additional parking requirements. So this really is targeting surface parking lots, and we're trying to discourage surface parking lots. You're still able to do it, but if you're going to do a surface parking lot, you're really looking at doing a permeable surface in order to do that. Trying to encourage is, again, alley access. Hopefully it's in structured parking, multi-stories, but if that doesn't work, then looking to do a more sustainable green feature with a permeable surface on the surface parking lots. Slide. Real quickly, we regulate materials, but we wanted to allow more flexibility in the TRO. Essentially, we moved, I believe, wood and metal up into primary building materials, where in other districts those might not be allowed. EFIS, vinyl, and highly reflective are still consistent materials that generally people in our community don't see those as good exterior building materials. Next slide. These are just some little nuances, again, to help encourage that urban context. How do we create that eyes in the street, pedestrian scale? And making sure that landscaping and other things are kind of more consistent with the whole neighborhood. Maximum parking. Again, there's maximums. We talked a little bit about minimums, but here we're trying to help incentivize, encourage the use of the parking structure and getting more residential uses on those lots within the sites. And we reduce the parking maximums by 50%. That shouldn't impact too much, because some of our parking maximums are actually pretty high. I would think that the lot sizes will constrain maximum parking more than the standard law. But next slide. Incentives, just kind of highlight the current code. If you do affordability or sustainability, you get into that floor plate scenario. So if you do one of those voluntarily, you get a bump in your maximum floor plate. If you do both, you get a bigger bump. Essentially, what we're doing here is very similar to what we've done in some other districts to help incentivize sustainability or affordability. If you do one or other, you get a little bump. If you do both, you get a pretty big bump. So here you essentially would double your maximum square footage.
What percentage of affordable housing has to be? What's the minimum?
15%. That's the great question. Sorry for not clarifying that. So 15% is the minimum amount. We can certainly require more the negotiations of a developer comes in. So obviously the core building, there's a proposal being considered to reuse that. That's going to be a lot more than 15% of that one instance. And square footage wise, John, you might have to help me, but I always think of the Best Buy on the east side of town. That's about a 20,000 square foot building. So that's a pretty big building when you think of 20,000 square feet to visualize that. So again, lot sizes might dictate the maximum floor plates, but
it'd be one half of the old Lucky's building.
yeah,
That's a 44,000 square foot.
okay, thanks, John. Yeah, next slide. And then I don't want to get too much into the tier 1 or tier 2, but that's affordability. So if you think of tier 1, it's anything 120% below AMI. That's our kind of workforce housing. Tier 2, you've got to get into the more deeper affordability. So we're looking at 90% and below 80 AMI. Essentially, the takeaway message here that's different than the rest of the city is we're doubling the incentives that you get here than you would elsewhere in the city. So elsewhere in the city, you only get 1 floor for tier 1, an additional floor for tier 2, and an additional floor or half story for sustainability. But here you're actually get up to 5 additional floors if you do tier 2 and sustainability. So it's a pretty big incentive, we hope, to really encourage that.
So you get 2 incentives. You can get one for your floor square footage and another one for your height.
Correct. Yeah, and that's same everywhere in the city, but here you're really kind of getting a much bigger bang. Yeah, much bigger bang for your buck on the floor. And I think there's just one more slide. Oh, yes. And so the next one is what we call departures. And so what the director of transportation can do is a really awesome project comes in, and there might be something in code that says, oh, you have too much metal on your building in the primary. Like there's something in code that just trips them up. You're not really eligible to get a variance. I could kind of determine, or my predecessor could determine that saying, hey, this is a pretty exceptional design. Kick it up for public review to say, hey, this is really checks all the boxes, but for some reason there's something in the code we couldn't justify a variance or we couldn't deviate from code. This allowed the ability to kind of bring that something special to there. Because I think some of the concerns we've heard, obviously with code, is sometimes they're rigid on what standards and designs and what we have, and we don't want to get maybe the same look as we move forward. So that is something unique to the TRO that isn't allowed elsewhere, and kind of is really allowed to the plan commission. It would go to the plan commission. So the minor major site plan, there's some more incentives on approvals. Like if you were to do an affordability, that's something that can be done at the stack level depending on the size. If it gets bigger, it goes to what's called a major site plan, that goes to plan commission. Likewise, if somebody comes in with something really cool that doesn't quite check every box in the UDO, we could say, hey, this is pretty exceptional, and we'll kick it to plan commission, regardless if it's staff level. And that way, it kind of has a little bit more awareness for the community of like, oh, why did this get approved? Say a public hearing that way. Yeah.
And so who determines that exceptional architectural design? Is that you?
Right now it's me. But in all honesty, we would review a petition, and obviously, somebody came forward with an option to buy a property, we would have that conversation about them. And oftentimes there might be something in the code that would be like, oh, well, we want to do this. Like, well, code won't allow you to do that. I'm not sure we could support that variance. A good example is what we did for the core building. Because it was locally designated as a historic building, they ran into some issues with the code. It was much easier to support those variants because of the local historic designation. But if that wasn't the case, it might be harder to justify that project unless there was something really cool about the designs or that determination. And staff would say, well, hey, and I can't remember the package of every member. I mean, there was quite a number of variances that we had to get for the court before we got through. And we wouldn't want variances to hold up a project in this context like the court. I think that's all I have. Thanks.
Questions for Scott? Any more than we've asked already? So
Can we
the,
get a copy of Scott's slides?
sure, yeah. Guys, would you mind sending us that?
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. That's helpful. So for us, while we will be interfacing with our owners rep, we have one, it's really going to be their job to really understand what we can and can't do based on the new overlays and the zoning regulations there. And then, of course, they would work with you to understand those before we go to market and try to recruit somebody to come in and work through the process that we have. So that's why I wanted us to have a kind of a general high-level view of what has been done to the site, which is different. The zoning here is different than anywhere else in the city as a result of the master plan coming first and giving us some guidance on how to zone it as you were going through the UDO updates at that time too. So
Yeah, and I would say that, you know, Deb helped us kind of vet some feedback that we've received. So hopefully, you know, we've got the standards right, but I mean, it is somewhat as, you know, Mayor Hamilton always says, it's a 3-ring binder. If we're doing things that are problematic, you know, I'm happy to bring it through the process to make those changes. We've done that, and every year we've amended the code. So that's something that I'm prepared to package up if we're getting a pretty cool project coming through, and there's some standard in there that's really making it challenging.
And to mention, some of you know this, but Scott's team is represented on the selection team for the first RFI because they know this inside and out, right? And so, give your gentleman's name who's on the call. Ryan, yes. And Ryan would say, well, I know they're proposing that, but that's not possible. And, so like they immediately can tell us like what on those really early in those proposals, like what's possible, what's not possible. So a huge value in that selection process to make sure we don't get super excited about something that suddenly
Not gonna happen.
it may not happen. So far, I don't think we need to invoke the exceptional design.
Well, I do, and I appreciate that. And I think it is going to be really important. This is, not only is this project just the statement that it's going to be for the community, but I think it also gives a real opportunity to talk about the flexibility and the solid information that we can give the developers, that they know what they're walking into and what they can and can't do, and where there are flexible pieces, because that's what we hear over and over and over again is the challenge of working in the Bloomington community. So I hope that we are able to use this project as a chance to kind of say, this is the way we want it to be, and we think it will work better for you. And so that's what I look forward to on that.
Pieces also have to work, the zoning pieces have to work and sometimes we over restrict and cause more expense. So
No, completely.
we've got to be real cognizant. We can't maybe have it both ways.
okay, thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. The last item I see on here is we kind of stopped at the update on RFI 1 and those blocks, unless you already.
I would just say that we had two, I want to say complete proposals. The third one, we asked for additional information. We just received that. So that's going back out to the for questions and comments. We are in a phase where we are seeking input on some clarifications with them. At the same time, we want to make sure that our owners development rep gets an opportunity to weigh in on this before we take anything forward. So I would assume that most of the next steps for that review are going to happen in June. Or after.
Right.
Okay. Did get the additional information that
We did.
Oh, we did. Oh,
we did.
excellent.
We'll be sending that out.
Thank you for the members who are sitting in on that. You have some homework coming up.
That's true.
It's time for public comment. There are a few folks out there that have been listening in. Thank you for your interest in the CBCI's work. Are there any comments from the public? I don't see any unmuting going on from the attendees. So thank you again for your interest. And then I just think we need a motion to adjourn.
I'll move to adjourn.
I'll second. I do. Wouldn't do that.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
We're officially adjourned. Next meeting is 2 weeks from now. Don't forget to watch the audience meeting.